Haribol, we're just starting Srimad Bhagavatam class. We're in the third canto. I'm just finding it here. Okay. Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari Jaya Gopi Janavallabha Girivaradhari Yashodanandana Brajajannaranjana Yamunatira Vanachari Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari Jaya Gopi Janavallabha Girivaradhari Jaya Gopi Janavallabha Girivaradhari Yashodanandana Brajajannaranjana Yashodanandana Brajajannaranjana Yamunatira Vanachari Yamunatira Vanachari Jai Om Vishnu Paramahamsa Parivajrikacharya Stotra Stotra Shri Shrimad His Divine Grace A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai. Grantharaj Srimad Bhagavatam Ki Jai. All glories to assembled devotees, Hare Krishna. All glories to assembled devotees, Hare Krishna. All glories to the assembled devotees, Hare Krishna. All glories to the lotus feet of Shri Guru and Gauranga. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. This is reading from Srimad Bhagavatam, third canto. It's not telling me what the chapter is. Well, I don't know what the chapter is, but we know that it's Lord Kapila and Devahuti. I couldn't find my book, so I'm using my iPad, and it doesn't show the chapter title. Anyway, it's text number 35. Bhakti yogascha maya manav yudirtaha yayor ekatarenaiva purushaha purusham brajet. Bhakti yogascha maya manyav yudirtaha yayor ekatarenaiva purushaha purusham brajet. Bhakti yogascha maya manav yudirtaha yayor ekatarenaiva purushaha purusham brajet. Bhakti yoga, devotional service, cha, and yoga, mystic yoga, cha, also, maya, by me, manavi, O daughter of Manu, udir ita, described, yoyoya, of which two, ekatarena, by either one, eva alone, purusha, a person, purusham, the supreme person, Brajet can achieve. Translation by Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai. My dear mother, O daughter of Manu, a devotee who applies the science of devotional service and mystic yoga in this way can achieve the abode of the Supreme Person simply by that devotional service. Let's read that again. My dear mother, O daughter of Manu. This is, of course, Kapila Dev speaking to his mother, Devahuti. My dear mother, O daughter of Manu, a devotee who applies the science of devotional service and mystic yoga in this way can achieve the abode of the Supreme Person simply by that devotional service. That's pretty exciting. Okay, purport by Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai. Herein, the Supreme Personality of Godhead, Kapila Dev, perfectly explains the mystic yoga system, consisting of 8 different kinds of yoga activities. He explains that the mystic yoga system, consisting of 8 different kinds of yoga activities, has to be performed with the aim of coming to the perfectional stage of bhakti yoga. It is not acceptable for one to be satisfied simply by practicing the sitting postures and thinking himself complete. By meditation, one must attain the stage of devotional service. As previously described, a yogi is advised to meditate on the form of Lord Vishnu, from point to point, from the ankles to the legs, to the knees, to the thighs, to the chest, to the neck, and in this way, gradually up to the face and then to the ornaments. There is no question of impersonal meditation. When, by meditation on the Supreme Personality of Godhead in all detail, one comes to the point of love of God, that is the point of bhakti yoga. And at that point, he must actually render service to the Lord out of transcendental love. Anyone who practices yoga and comes to the point of devotional service can attain the Supreme Personality of Godhead in his transcendental abode. Here it is clearly stated, Purusha, Purusham Brajet. The Purusha, the living entity, goes to the Supreme Person. The Supreme Personality of Godhead and the living entity are qualitatively one. Both are defined as Purusha. The quality of Purusha exists both in the Supreme Godhead and in the living entity. Purusha means enjoyer, and the spirit of enjoyment is present both in the living entity and in the Supreme Lord. The difference is that the quality of enjoyment is not equal. The living entity cannot experience the same quantity of enjoyment as the Supreme Personality of Godhead. An analogy may be made with a rich man and a poor man. The propensity for enjoyment is present in both, but the poor man cannot enjoy in the same quantity as the rich man. When the poor man dovetails his desires with those of the rich man, however, and when there is cooperation between the poor man and the rich man, or between the big and the small man, then the enjoyment is shared equally. That is like bhakti yoga. Purushaha Purusham Brajet. When the living entity enters into the kingdom of God and cooperates with the Supreme Lord by giving him enjoyment, he enjoys the same facility or the same amount of pleasure as the Supreme Personality of Godhead. On the other hand, when the living entity wants to enjoy by imitating the Supreme Personality of Godhead, his desire is called Maya, and it puts him in the material atmosphere. Oops. A living entity who wants to enjoy on his personal account and not cooperate with the Supreme Lord is engaged in materialistic life. As soon as he dovetails his enjoyment with the Supreme Personality of Godhead, he is engaged in spiritual life. An example may be cited here. The different limbs of the body cannot enjoy life independently. They must cooperate with the whole body and supply food to the stomach. In so doing, all the different parts of the body enjoy equally in cooperation with the whole body. That is the philosophy of Achintya Bheda Tattva. Simultaneous oneness and difference. The living entity cannot enjoy life in opposition to the Supreme Lord. He has to dovetail his activities with the Lord by practicing bhakti yoga. It is said herein that one can approach the Supreme Personality of Godhead by either the yoga process or the bhakti yoga process. This indicates that factually there is no difference between yoga and bhakti yoga because the target of both is Vishnu. In the modern age, however, a yoga process has been manufactured which aims at something void and impersonal. Actually, yoga means meditation on the form of Lord Vishnu. If the yoga practice is actually performed according to the standard direction, there is no difference between yoga and bhakti yoga. Okay. Om Jnana Timirandasya Nananjana Shalakaya Chakshurunmilitam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha. Jai Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhara Shri Vasari Gaura Bhaktavrindam Hare Krishna 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 Hare Hare Rama 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 Hare Hare. I was born in the darkest ignorance, and my spiritual master kindly forced open my eyes with the torchlight of knowledge. I offer my humble obeisances as such a spiritual master. Jai. Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai. Translation again. This is, for anyone who came late, third canto, chapter 29, of which I can't tell you the title, but we know it's Devahuti and her son, Kapila Dev. Text number 35. I'm reading from my iPad, and it doesn't show me the chapter title, sorry. Translation again. My dear mother, O daughter of Manu, a devotee who applies the science of devotional service and mystic yoga in this way can achieve the abode of the Supreme simply by that devotional service. So, boy, there's so much to talk about here. That was a long purport for one. But let's just start with what is devotional service? So Prabhupada here he makes a few nice points, like that there's no difference between the yoga system and bhakti yoga, because they both aim at Vishnu. And he says, but the problem is that we've lost sight of what the word yoga really means, and that yoga there's been propaganda put out that the yoga system, meaning the Ashtanga yoga system, is aiming at something void and impersonal. And so Prabhupada here is using the words Purusha and Purusham to point out how incorrect that is. And by this verse itself that the Bhagavatam says, I'll just read that little part of the verse again. Yayor ekatarenaiva purushaha purusham brajet. By either one, ekatarena means by either one, eva means alone, purushaha purusham. So that both the person and the supreme person are both persons. And that bhakti yoga and yoga, devotional service and mystic yoga, and ekatarenaiva. So what Prabhupada said in the purport is also right in the verse, in the literal Sanskrit. Bhakti yoga is one word and yoga is another word. And then ekatarena, which literally means by either one, which means either one heads to the same destination, which is Vishnu. And then the conclusion is, sorry about that. The Facebook just crashed and the video cut out. So anyway, I'll give people a moment to rejoin who wish to. We're discussing the third canto. Maybe I'll try and find out what all people are trying to rejoin. I will try and find out what the chapter is called. The chapter is called Explanation of Devotional Service by Lord Kapila. Ki Jai. Explanation of Devotional Service by Lord Kapila. So, sorry about that we lost that feed. Anyway, we're back on, and we're just discussing what is devotional service. So this verse states that mystic yoga and bhakti yoga, or devotional service, either one can achieve the goal. They both aim towards Vishnu or Krishna. So, and what does it mean that both the living entity and the supreme are persons? Purusha and Purusham. It's the same word, and one Prabhupada translates as us, and the other Prabhupada translates as the supreme person. And so, which gets to what is devotional service? Because there's something in science which, and if you call the yoga systems a system, which Prabhupada is here, a system means a science. That's why we have the word ology connected to so many sciences like geology, etc. And so psychology, they wanted to be a science also. So if you want to, and ology means an organized, systematic understanding of a topic or an area of inquiry, of knowledge. So it means an organized, systematic study of that area of knowledge. And so if we call it yogaology, as Prabhupada is here, like yoga system, then that means a science. And so one of the basic features, one of the basic tenets of science is that there are necessary causes behind every effect. And so science means to look for, it's the process of identifying and looking for the necessary causes that are present in an effect. So, and that means you have an effect. There's say a disease, and then you start looking for the causes of that disease because you know that it's a basic tenet, a basic principle of science, of knowledge, that the cause must be present in the effect. So if we see, and as we do in this verse, it's stated very clearly, the conclusion stated very clearly that there's a Purusha, that's a person. And so, in other words, that's an effect. We can study, we can see the effect. So the effect is that basically as you go up the scale of consciousness, that everything becomes more and more personal. So, and so like, for instance, you don't consider that, I had a really great conversation with my pet worm this morning, right? Like, I've got a pet worm and I feel so much, personal love and reciprocation coming from my pet worm. I mean, maybe for some extraordinary nature saint people or something, but for the rest of us, no. People experience more of a connection, a personal connection, more personality. In other words, a worm, we don't really talk about like, my worm, I saw my worm this morning and I was so excited by how much personality it exhibited, right? My pet worm. But your pet dog or cat, some people are very excited about their personalities because they have much more personality. As we go up the consciousness scale, there's always more and more personality. And so hopefully even for human beings, as they become more educated, they acquire more and more personality and not less, or their personality becomes more and more pleasing and not less, which would be the goal of education. And so what does that mean? It means that, of course, obviously there's a cause for even that we live in a real universe, right? Otherwise, there's no point in even talking. There's no point in even mentioning science, because one of the basic other fundamentals of science, one of the basic assumptions of science, which is a metaphysical assumption. You can't have all assumptions are metaphysical, by the way. And which is why it's idiotic for science to talk about how nothing can allowed to be true that's not empirically observable, because all of the assumptions that science is founded on cannot be empirically observable. They're metaphysical assumptions by definition. So, like for instance, that we live in a real world. So no science can be done except on the assumption that we live in a real world. Except you can't prove we live in a real world. You can't say, well, this is a real, whatever you want to call it, cloth, and therefore we live in a real world, because that's circular reasoning. You can't use the object that you're trying to prove as evidence to prove it. That's just circular reasoning. It goes around in a circle. And so there's no empiricism just means physical things you can observe and measure. It literally means what you can measure. So empiricism can't prove that we live in a real world. That's not possible. You can't use your physical empirical senses to prove that the world is a real world. How would you go about doing that? You can't do it. So you just have to make the assumption that we live in a real world. And we do that in some ways, partly because, like when you wake up for a dream, it proves itself to you by what? By the quality of your experience of it. Metaphysical facts prove themselves to you by the quality of their experience of them. And that includes the quality of your experience of being able to reason in a proper way about metaphysical things even. So, like for instance, that you're a Purusha, you're a person. Person means you have personality, and you can tell by your quality of the experience of your life that you have personality. So therefore, Prabhupada is pointing out very strongly in this verse what a misconception it is to exclude the personal from the yoga systems, and that actually is something that's perpetrated as propaganda in the day and age that we live in now, to confuse people, because it's not particularly very scientific either, because there's an effect called that I have a personality, and I can see in nature that all of the scale of consciousness, as you go up the scale of consciousness, things acquire more and more personality. And so obviously I myself, I have a personality, and I'm higher on the scale than a dog. That's obvious. That proves itself to me. But I'm not creating anything, really, am I, beyond what's within a very short range of where I am. Like, for instance, there's a painting behind me. Those are paintings that my daughter painted, and they're wonderful. They're nice. I like those paintings. But she can't paint. She can't create the mountain, can she? No, she cannot. She can paint it, with going about a half a meter from her brain out from her body, using her fingers. She can reach out to the canvas and paint. That's about as far as she can go. She can't create the mountain. So if I'm not the creator, then there must be a cause of the creation that my personality is operating in, and also a cause of me, which is obvious. And therefore, if personality is present in the effect in me, and is present in all the other conscious effects that are in the scale of consciousness, from the worm to the dog to the human beings, etc. And of course, then, I think it's also relatively obvious and evident that depending on their education, different people exhibit a different scale of personality as human beings also, which is the purpose of education, to be able to rise up the scale of expression of your own personality. I think that's a lot better definition for education than just you suffer under a gigantic amount of data processing, stress and anxiety, pressure to compete with other people who can process the most amount of data. I think that's a very nice definition of education. I think a better definition of education is what allows each and every one of us to ascend up the scale of consciousness as human beings, also allowing us to exhibit more of our real personality. And that's one definition for a spiritual life, I would say. And why is that spiritual? Because the scientific presence, or the scientific premise, or the scientific tenet is, the principle is, that the effect must be present in the cause. And if we have an effect, we can understand where it's coming from, and we can understand our position relative to that circumstance that is created by that effect, if we look for the cause. But that cause is present in the effect. So that's why we can have a disease and then start looking for the cause. The disease points us in the direction we should go. Otherwise, we'd never be able to, create any drugs or natural remedies or anything else. Natural remedies also are solutions based on looking for a cause. So, and the ultimate natural remedy for how do we fix whatever problems we may have in our personality through education is that our personality is a cause, is an effect. In other words, we're the small personality. I can't, my daughter can create a beautiful picture, which makes her father so proud and happy, but I can't create the mountains myself and then be proud of myself. Hey, I created a mountain. Aren't I fantastic? No. So there has to be a cause for my position relative to the mountains. Like, why am I experiencing mountains? Why do I get to feel happy that my daughter can paint a mountain? So that cause must be present because I'm the effect. And therefore, if the effect is ever increasing personality, then at the top of the personality scale that has the capability to create all other personalities. So all other personalities are relative, they're in somewhere in a scale, but there then has to be some absolute personality that is capable of explaining all the other personalities. Or another way of putting it, a little more abstract, is that if you stop looking, you stop doing science, you stop being a rational person, which Prabhupada points out here, you've stopped understanding yoga, you've stopped understanding systems, you've stopped being a rational person if you stop looking for one absolute cause that explains all other causes, or one absolute truth that explains all relative truths. It certainly is true that small truths are all relative to each other. But how did the small truths get there? Right? There has to be a source, a cause. Just like, how did the disease happen? There had to have been a source, a cause. Otherwise, you can't ascend on the scale of health and fix the problem. So I'm very grateful that the yoga systems exist, that there's an ology, that there's a science where actually my expression of my own personality, if I apply myself to the yoga system, I'm able to have that system prove its efficacy to me by the quality of my experience of it. I don't have to believe in it. I don't have to be forced into it by, someone else who may or may not have my best interest at heart. I can just participate in the science. Everybody loves science these days, right? I'm talking to you over the results of science, the Facebook Live magic of all the chips and internet connection and broadband wavelengths and everything else that's going on. We all love that. That's fantastic. So, and we also love, those who are tuning in, love the Bhagavatam, because the Bhagavatam is an experience of connecting. The word yoga means to connect, to link, to us as a small personality to the supreme personality. That it's a very rational, enjoyable thing to do. I mean, I don't know about you, but I like to do things. I enjoy doing things that are reasonable, that are rational, that have a scientific basis, that increases my understanding of who I am and what my life is. I find that really pleasant and pleasurable. In fact, I think Prabhupada in the purport, as I was reading, he talks about enjoyment. Here it is. Purusha means enjoyer, because the word Purusha itself means enjoyer. In other words, like if we talk about things like that there are purposes for our life, that life has meaning. It's not just a meaningless void. Then if there's meaning, if there's objective purposes for your life, not just that I set a purpose for myself, like, I want to get up and I'm going to start my day off, by being warm. So I'm going to turn the heater on when I wake up. That's a purpose I set for myself. And the goal is to be warm. But I might wake up and say, no, my goal is to be austere and, I want to, invigorate my immune system a little. I'm going to get up and I'm just going to be cold in the morning and do jumping jacks and get my blood circulating. And so my goal is to be cold to improve my health. But those are both goals that I just set for myself and I can change them. They're subjective goals, in other words. But a science means that if there's a science of purpose, of meaning in life, then, which is what the yoga system claims to be. It claims to be a science of purpose and meaning. Then those purposes are objective. In other words, even if I don't know what those purposes are, they're objective purposes. It means they're operating even if I'm not aware of them. Even if I don't care about them, that doesn't matter because they care about me, right? And so they're objective purposes. And if there's objective purposes, purpose means intent. If there's going to be intent, there has to be consciousness. So because an impersonal void cannot have any purpose, doesn't have purposes. and it's something that's impersonal. The only thing that can have intent is a personality. There's no such thing as intent in an impersonal void. That's not even a way of speaking. So if there's going to be intent, there has to be a person. There has to be. And intent means that you have intents because you want to enjoy the outcome of the intent, isn't it? Otherwise, there's no reason to have an intent. So Prabhupada is pointing out here, the word Purusha literally means enjoyer, because that's fundamental to reality, to who we are. That consciousness is personal, always. It means, and personality means that there's something that has meaning to you, and things that have meaning to you are pleasurable, right? You don't choose goals that are going to harm you. Everyone chooses goals in one way or another because they're pleasing to them, they're enjoyable. So he says, I'll just quote Prabhupada again, Purusha means enjoyer, and the spirit of enjoyment is present both in the living entity and in the Supreme Lord. The cause must be present in the effect. The Supreme obviously is the cause, because I'm not the Supreme. The difference is that the quantity of enjoyment is not equal. The living entity cannot experience the same quantity of enjoyment as the Supreme Personality of Godhead. So what does that mean? How is devotional service then a science based on these principles? Well, it's really very simple. I mean, one of the difficulties that scientists trying to make, I should say, some scientists, not all scientists, there is a certain class of scientists who actually claim to be doing science when instead they're doing something called philosophical materialism. And philosophical materialism is not science, it's a philosophy, because materialism, the claim that nothing can exist that I can't find in my microscope, is not empirically provable. The claim that nothing can be true except for what's empirical is a philosophical or religious statement. It's not science. No one can prove, because truth is not something you can find in your microscope, can you? Anybody, I mean, most of us went to university or studied some biology with our microscopes in high school. Did you ever find truth in your microscope? No, you did not, because truth is a metaphysical principle. There's physics, things you can find in your microscope, and then there's metaphysics. Meta just means above or beyond, right? Or in other words, what's superior to physics, literally, as Aristotle, he gave us those terms. So you're not finding truth in your microscope, which is why it's ridiculous for a certain class of scientists to say that that nothing can be true except what they can find in their microscope. So, because that's a religious statement, that's not a scientific statement. So, however, I do think, and Prabhupada is here stating, that we can have a scientific system of yoga, and that metaphysical system can have a metaphysical science, and that we can actually make advancement in our own consciousness by ascending up the scale of consciousness with a scientific method, and that scientific method is devotional service, according to Prabhupada. So I just want to conclude by stating what then is devotional service. As this science, as this ology, as this system, as Prabhupada describes it. And a system means an ology. It means a way of understanding the world in an organized way. So, and that also applies to yoga, according to Srila Prabhupada. So, one of the troubles we have with science is that there are some bad actors who really are making religious statements, but who claim that it's science, who basically want to insist that nothing is science unless I can control it. In other words, one of the main tenets also of the scientific method is that there must be a controlled experiment, a duplicatable controlled experiment. And this is really the heart of the scientific method, the controlled experiment. And that's fine, because the truth is that the Purusha, the person who's the scientist, is able to control at least a certain amount of the factors, the conditions of the experiment. And that's why we can end up with iPhones and I can talk to you, during the lockdown, which I'm grateful for. That's wonderful. I'm personally very grateful that scientists are superior to matter as persons, which they are, because consciousness is superior to matter. And they can control the experiments and they can produce wonderful iPhones. That's fabulous. I'm all in favor. That's wonderful. However, you cannot then say that nothing is allowed to exist or be true that I'm not superior to, which is what philosophical materialism tries to do. In other words, it's not allowed to be true unless I'm superior to it and I can control it. Okay, if you want to call that science, go right ahead. I personally call that a psychological problem, not science. If nothing's allowed to be true except what I can be superior to and what I can control, I think that's a psychological problem. That's not so much some aspect of science that should be glorified or people should follow. So, however then what should we follow? If we want to know if we actually may, deep down in the deepest core of who we are, accept that there can be truths or objective purposes for our life, which are not able to be controlled materially by some materialistic scientist who maybe has a philosophical materialism philosophy or religion, in other words, that maybe deep down in the deepest core of who I am, I know that there are some moral, objective, truths in the world that prove themselves to me by my quality of my experience of them, by my engagement with the scale of consciousness. I can see that there are objective truths would help me to rise up the scale of consciousness or fall down it, and therefore increase my pleasure in experiencing my own advancement in the expression of my personality. I would call that education, by the way. So if there can be education, that means that there's some underlying science of it, right? Isn't it? That's why science is such a big part of education these days, material science. But why not make metaphysical science also a part of education, which increases students' ability to express themselves as persons, fully express their personality by understanding where they fit in the scale of consciousness and where they can go if they act according to or connect themselves to the scale of consciousness. That does take a little bit of knowledge, of course, which there's a little bit of stress and anxiety also on the path of metaphysical education, because we do have to apply ourselves. The Bhagavatam's a pretty big book. What is it, 18 volumes? How many verses is it? It's, I forget now, 18,000 verses, right? So there's a little bit of anxiety. I know I was in a lot of anxiety. I used to go stand in front of the deities, and I felt so much anxiety. I'm standing in front of the deities, in front of Nitai temple, and I didn't know anything about them. It was driving me crazy. Every day I'd stand there. I didn't know anything about them, so I had a tremendous amount of anxiety. I gotta read the Bhagavatam, the Chaitanya Charitamrita. Couldn't even read the Chaitanya Charitamrita until I got to the Bhagavatam. I used to sit on my shelf, shining in gold every day, and I used to have so much anxiety, thinking, "Oh my God, I know nothing about Nitai. I gotta finish the Bhagavatam, 18,000 verses before I can even get to the Chaitanya Charitamrita." Anyway, so we have a little anxiety on our side too. But fortunately, there's a lot of nectar compensation in that we literally feel our personality rising up the scale of consciousness. And so I better really finish here now. What's the science of that? What's the science of, okay, if the heart of the scientific method, in other words, the object of search after knowledge materially is that you must be superior to the matter and be in control of it. And you have an object of search which is material, and that's perfectly appropriate to control what's material because you are the superior as a materialistic scientist. And that's wonderful. And that's produced a lot of fabulous things. And I mean, all glories. So, but what then is the heart of the method? And is there also a very appropriate object of search for obtaining knowledge of truth that is metaphysical? If we don't just, stick our head in the sand and say, well, I don't want to hear about it if I can't find it in my microscope. And that's never proven very valuable for people because, we have a lot of science in the world today. We have a tremendous number of PhDs, and yet the world still has a lot of problems. So we already can feed everybody on the planet. Why aren't we feeding people on the planet? It's certainly not because we're lacking in the physical science to be able to feed everybody on the planet. No, we're lacking in metaphysical science. And what's the metaphysical science then? What's the object of search after knowledge if we want to go for that? So the object of search is not matter, but consciousness. And that's understandable because we can experience ourselves as a consciousness, but we're not the supreme consciousness. So if we have just a tiny bit of humility, we can say, okay, I'm not the supreme consciousness. So if I want to have a science, maybe that science can be the object of search after that science is for a supreme consciousness. And now, what then is the methodology for gaining knowledge of something that's superior to me, a consciousness that's superior to me? If there's going to be a science, then there has to be a methodology, obviously. So that methodology is really straightforward, and it perfectly fits the object of search, just like the methodology called the controlled experiment perfectly fits the object of search if your object of search is combinations of matter. That's called the controlled experiment. But can I apply the controlled experiment to something superior to me? Can I go to the supreme consciousness and say, I control you. Give me knowledge. Is that going to fly? Is that going to work? Because how can I control what I'm inferior to? I can't produce any mountains. I'm the inferior, right? Can I create any life? No. Can I have a hard enough time understanding my own life and my own personality. Can I control the supreme personality? No. So therefore, the method of search for knowledge perfectly aligns with the object of search, as any science should, on the metaphysical side, on the side of yoga and bhakti yoga, very well. So bhakti yoga, devotional service, is a science, because what does devotion mean? It means that you're applying the proper method of search for knowledge of what's superior to you. In other words, you have to please. That's very simple. Of course, psychologically, we have a little trouble with that because our personality is a little mixed up with our attachment to matter. And that's understandable. Here we are. We have a material body and mind. So it's not like we have to beat up on ourselves and just think it's so bad. Like me, if I would have, been in the temple feeling so bad, I'm standing in front of the deities, I don't know anything about them. My personality's so stunted. Should I just go and commit suicide or not come to the temple? No, I should just actually read the books, right? So fortunately, thank you to all the encouragement I got from all of you who may be watching. I read the books, and hopefully my personality has improved somewhat. You can tell me if the scientific experiment has worked at all. But I think that it has. I hope it has anyway. And so therefore there's a science where the cause is present in the effect, and we're able to apply a perfect methodology that perfectly... The reason it's perfect is that it's perfectly appropriate to, perfectly congruent with, or as they say in philosophy, perfectly coherent with the object of search for the knowledge that I'm after, which is what is superior to me. If you've stopped looking for an absolute truth that explains all relative truths, you've stopped being a rational human being. You cannot really call yourself interested in science or education, which is why it's so important for education to focus on something more than just a tremendous amount of stress to process a tremendous amount of material data. I mean, that's okay, but it's hard to keep that up without also increasing our personality, our love for learning, which has got to be a real love for learning, has got to encompass the whole part of who we are, which is what education is. So, by the way, the word for school, I mean, we're kind of in the Bhakti Yoga school. We even have Bhakti Yoga schools. Not enough, not anywhere near enough. It's tragic, actually. I mean, the Hare Krishna school we have here is incredibly. I remember telling Dev Swami, we're gonna change the world. The Hare Krishna school is the greatest place on earth. You know, we've got to, let everybody know about our schools. And he's like, whoa, slow down there. He says, the Hare Krishna school is very rare in ISKCON. What's happening here in New Zealand is very unique. It's very rare. He was like, hold it. It's not like we can just start putting all our schools on TV and broadcasting to the world how great our schools are and everybody should join, because we don't have any. It's very rare what's happening here in New Zealand. I was so excited. I was like, anyway. And so we need more schools. But here's an interesting fact for you, which we should be teaching people. I mean, I'm making a small effort trying to teach, these teenagers that are coming, that the word school is Greek. It's a Greek word. Like Prabhupada puts a tremendous amount of Greek and Latin. I don't know if there's any in his purport here in the Bhagavatam. A huge number of, like summum bonum. What's that mean? Right? The Bhagavatam's the summum bonum. It means the highest good, right? That's Latin. Prabhupada could have said, the Uttama Satya, but he didn't, right? Why didn't he use Sanskrit to describe the Bhagavatam? Instead, he chose Latin, right? And a lot of Greek words also, like nomina and phenomena. Prabhupada uses those words all the time in the Bhagavatam. Like, for instance, the word phenomena we use all the time. We're so used to it because we've been, we're so in love with the material scientists. And phenomena means what you're studying materially. It means the study of matter. It means phenomena. Phenomena literally means what you can measure with your material senses. That's what the Greek word phenomena means. But a lot of people don't know that there's another word that's the opposite of phenomena. Just like you can't really understand east without understanding west. You can't understand north without south, right? There's always an opposite. In fact, the beginning of thinking really means categorical thinking, something Aristotle proved. And that's why one of the things you can do to help yourself, if you're feeling bewildered by somebody's propaganda, is start to look for the opposites of the words that they're using. Because a lot of times we've lost the opposites in our language, which is what George Orwell tried to point out. Or the opposites have been used against us in an inappropriate way. That's why we got that book, 1984, everybody loves to quote today. Anyway, there's an opposite to the word phenomena, which is called nomina, which Srila Prabhupada uses in the Bhagavatam himself. Why? Because there's actually education around metaphysical things has been around a long time. It's not new to the Bhagavatam. So anyway, the word nomina means what's metaphysical. And I'll give you the dictionary definition. Objects of intellectual intuition devoid of all phenomenal attributes. That's the Oxford English Dictionary for the word nomina. We use nomina all the time. Even teenagers come home from a concert and they're like, oh, I went to the concert and it was phenomenal. Britney Spears or whoever, it was phenomenal. I loved it, right? In other words, they're trying to express something about their personality, their enthusiasm for that, pop star. And that's fine. That's wonderful. Phenomena is a really amazing word, vocabulary word. It's nice that they learn it. But we should have schools that also teach that there's another side to reality. We live in a bi-dimensional world where you can't really understand East, phenomena, without understanding West, nomina. So if you understand who you are and really express your whole complete personality, not just when you're all excited, like an excited electron because you went to see Britney Spears, but actually what happens when you go to see the deities, right? You stand in front of the deities and you're also getting excited, but it's another side, another dimension of reality that we're excited by, called the nominal dimension of reality. Real objects of intellectual intuition devoid of all phenomenal attributes. So That's a different kind of schooling to learn this kind of vocabulary. And if you look up the words Prabhupada has in the Bhagavatam, you'll get that. Prabhupada didn't deny us anything. We actually can have schools. I mean, I'm doing it, teaching a school to teenagers where they're getting a world-class education just by reading Prabhupada's books. All you have to do is look up the words in the dictionary and have some discussion about them, right? Like the Socratic method, dialogue, right? It doesn't have to all be didactic. It doesn't have to all be endlessly processing, data processing to prove who can handle the most anxiety and stress, to do endless data processing and learn endless, little discrete bits of data, of knowledge, events and whatnot. Actually, we can have a discussion about what Srila Prabhupada wrote in the Bhagavatam and get a world-class education. Actually, everybody we admire for thousands of years had that education. So the Bhagavatam is very exciting. The yoga, mystic yoga and bhakti yoga are the same because they're both sciences which aim at Vishnu. It's just that bhakti yoga is so much easier because it's not very difficult to please the Supreme who loves you, right? I mean, the intention of the divine is love, isn't it? Isn't that the ultimate top of the ascension of consciousness is love? Don't we all experience that? Isn't all of our activities that we aim for really, when we think about the activities our personality wants to engage in, isn't the top of the scale love? Yes, it is. So our source loves us and wants us to thrive and succeed. So the Bhagavatam is non-different than Krishna. Idam Bhagavatam Nama Puranam Brahma Samhita Uttama Shloka Charitam. Uttama Shloka, the Bhagavatam, is the literary incarnation of Krishna. So in other words, it's a book form of this highest scale of love. And by studying it, we can have schools that study it. Then we can make so much advancement in education and in bhakti yoga, because bhakti yoga, devotional service, is a science. The cause is present in the effect. And our personality flourishes with that engagement, which is like unbelievably exciting. Anyway, so the word school, since I brought up school, is another Greek word. A lot of people don't know like the etymology of school. It's a Greek word. And people think, well, it means like to be educated, etc. Doesn't mean that. The word school is really exciting, very connected to the word nomina, actually, to this other dimension of reality we live in. Literally, the word school is a metaphysical word, because you know what it means in Greek? It means leisure. The word school literally means leisure. And what the brilliant Greek philosophers and sages, what they meant by that, the reason they came up with that word as their word for education, as their word for school, the reason they use the word leisure is meditation, is that you are able to draw out. The word education itself means literally ex plus ducere. Ducere means to draw, means to draw out the divine intelligence that's within you. So the word for school, where you do that, is literally the word for leisure. Some place that you're able to be at leisure, not oppressed by some, fantastic competition of who can, I would call it a phantasmagorical competition of who can, suffer the most austerity of data processing, but leisure, a place where you can actually meditate on, the name, fame, form activities of the Supreme Lord, which includes meditating on, the extraordinary literature that we can encounter. And great literature doesn't just describe matter. Great literature describes the other dimension of reality, like love and people's relationships and personalities and how it all interacts. So you can, there's obviously studying literature, like the Bhagavatam is the topmost literature, is appropriate for the science of bhakti yoga at a place called a school. So Prabhupada gave us everything. There's nothing wrong with knowing that you're your kids can get a world-class education. You yourself can get a world-class education by studying the Bhagavatam. One can derive from the study of the Bhagavatam all the benefits that are possible to be derived from the personal presence of the Lord. Carries with it all the transcendental blessings of Lord Sri Krishna that we can expect from his personal contact. That's the end of Prabhupada's purport to that verse I quoted about the Bhagavatam being Krishna. In other words, the Bhagavatam is an incarnation of Krishna's love. It's the intellectual, intelligent incarnation of Krishna's love. So anyway, I better stop there before my enthusiasm carries me away. Thank you for tuning in to Radhagiri Dadi's, Lord Chaitanya's Srimad Bhagavatam class. Granthraj Srimad Bhagavatam Ki Jai.